To me, 2024 seems to be a critical year. There's a sort of a convergence of all the crises in different categories of society. And to me, it's worse than 2008, the buildup. I don't want to be left in a position where I didn't put that thing into place or I didn't purchase that piece of equipment that I needed. So I'm feeling the pressure to get all of that done. I see the divergence between an analog world and a virtual world. I feel like we're actually very quickly put in a position where we need to make a choice to live one life or the other. And I don't want to be channeled into that virtual world. The elite have been preparing for this type of crisis for quite a while now. These are people that have inside information. So if they're doing it, when are we going to find out that we need to act?
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Well, it's a great honor today to have somebody who needs no introduction, I think, in the preparedness community. Shawn James, he's an outdoor enthusiast, off-grid, YouTube superstar, I would say, in a lot of people's minds, especially in this genre. I don't think he might not consider himself that, but I think he's as close as we're going to get to a modern-day Dick Pronicki as we're going to find here in the YouTube verse. And it's just great to have you on because obviously with everything going on in the world, and I know you are somebody I'd like to emulate in terms of my off-grid ambitions. It's great to have you on because I have a lot of things that I want to ask you about getting started into the lifestyle that you are currently living. And yeah, how are things going? How was your Christmas?
Great. Well, thanks for having me on. It's been a long time coming, so thank you. Been following your story too and trying to figure out where we kind of mesh together. And I think we're at that point where that's the case. Yeah, well, Christmas was great. Got to spend some time with the family, and we have a pretty close family, so it was nice to spend time with them.
Yeah, one thing I like about your videos is they have so much cinematography. It's really a great viewing experience to get away from a lot of the doom and gloom stuff that I get myself focused on often. It's kind of nice to see somebody who's out there living the lifestyle and just a more low stimulation sort of environment. So I'd encourage people to go and check out your channel if you want to see that kind of content. You know, on the topic of us dovetailing in some way our channels, there's definitely that overlap. And I think I'm starting to be solicited by a lot more people in genres that are not really even prepper adjacent. So I get the sense that this sort of preparedness thing is going mainstream, which I think is a sign of the times that people are really starting to get concerned about what's going on in the world. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what compelled you to lead this kind of lifestyle, because you weren't always an off-grid guy. At what point did you make the break, and what were some of the things that motivated you to do so?
You know, it's funny. You wonder how much of it's innate. And if I was to go back to my childhood, I grew up in a small town, like 25,000 people, I think, an hour north of Toronto. And my idea of a great time was to go into the woods, like walk into the neighboring municipality, which was a tiny little township, and build shelters and hunt. And well, it's where I learned to hunt and fish. I don't know. I was so drawn to that I had a real hard time focusing on school. And then when I was 17, reading Henry David Thoreau's Walden, especially, and Emerson at the time, I was really attracted to this individualistic lifestyle, this solo, sort of off-grid, self-reliant lifestyle. So it really goes right back to then. So at 17, with help from my parents, I actually bought my first property, which was 2.5 acres on an island in a lake, not too far from where I am now, actually. Built a little cabin on that, like just a stick frame cabin. And every weekend I would spend time in there. Anytime I was laid off from work, that's where I would go, like after high school. Never really left me. So then in my early 20s, I had sold that property and bought a mainland land property on the same lake and built my first log cabin and moved into it and wanted to stay there forever. But my parents were thinking I'd actually lost my mind. So I just talked to my mother about this on Christmas, actually. And she basically begged my dad to go and get me out of the woods and take me to the city and to work with him. under the premise that the mortgage wasn't getting paid on that property, even though it was really cheap, and I probably could have scrounged the money to do it. So I just went back to the city, and that's where I ended up staying essentially. I mean, not in the city, but living a more modern lifestyle and kind of just doing the typical cottage thing or camping thing on the weekend. And then, things were going along well until 2008 financial crisis hit. And by the time it made its way up through the construction industry here in Canada, it was 2010. And by the end of 2010, my commercial roofing business was failing. And I closed the doors at the end of 2010, took on $750,000 in debt personally. I took that on from the business and then just said, we got to get back to my original mindset, which is to live more self-reliant, more independent, and less dependent on the government and high-paying jobs and so on. Just start getting back to my true nature and back to basics. And I've been basically building that on that for the last 13 years.
Wow. So it was a bit of a boomerang effect, and you were compelled by this crisis. So there was a bit of motivation there that was centered around, obviously realizing the fragility of maybe the financial system. Is there anything in particular that has you concerned right now with respect to what is going on in the world that is motivating you to stay the course and become more and more refined in what you're doing? Because I remember when you first started off, it was just like the cabin, and it seems like every month I tune in and then there's another building or there's another aspect of this that you're introducing, and pretty soon you're going to have a full-on self permaculture homestead, it looks like. Is there something right now that you feel is driving you to continue in this lifestyle and continue to grow and develop?
I actually filmed a year-end video today, which will go up on my channel this weekend, talking about that. And I feel there's a sort of a convergence of all the crises and different categories of of society. And to me, it's worse than 2008, the buildup to that crisis. And I see it in economics. I see it in politics, in the environment, energy, like the policies of our government that are pulling us away from the fossil fuel reliance and towards renewable energy, despite the fact that we live in one of the most resource rich countries in the world. Like I just see a lot of mistakes being made, and I see I see the divergence between an analog world and a virtual world that I don't like, and I feel like we're actually very quickly being put in a position where we need to make a choice to live one life or the other. And I don't want to be channeled into that virtual world. It used to be a hobby, and I would even call what I was doing more of hobby homesteading up until probably 3 or 4 years ago, where I said, okay, we're selling our village house, we're moving up here, and we're just delving right into this. It's not, I no longer feel like it's a part-time or potentially a part-time endeavor for somebody. I think we're going to have to make a decision. And I feel like to me, 2024 seems to be a critical year. And I don't want to be left in a position where I didn't put that thing into place, or I didn't purchase that piece of equipment that I needed, or I didn't get the energy or the water resources in place. So I'm feeling the pressure to get all of that done, and I'm pretty close to it. I think I would say that if it hit the fan tomorrow, that we'd be just fine.
I would hope so, because if you're not going to be fine, then I think 99% of people are pretty screwed in this society. You're right with respect to the poly crisis and this culmination and really this election season coming up, and just the layer upon layer of tipping points that we're approaching has a lot of people concerned. And I think it's what, brought us together as well. And it's what is bringing a lot of these worlds together who never would have considered, who would have just thought this to be in the realm of fantasy before. People are starting to realize that maybe the music's going to stop here in this big old game of musical chairs. In terms of your desire to continue to refine, I like what you said about having to make a choice, because we really are at a point now where it seems like if you want to stay like on the grid, and you want to, you have to start giving up a lot of freedoms and liberties. And I think a great example of that is like electric cars. Like eventually, as great as they are, I mean, it's a marvel of engineering. It seems like there's going to be a Rubicon that we cross where there's not going to be any going back. And unless you are set up in advance and you are like able to grandfather whatever in that they've decide to make illegal in the future. I mean, do you get that sense that, there's going to be some kind of crackdown, and maybe it's just going to be a natural unfolding of that, or is it going to be like a authoritarian style government? I'm not sure if that makes any sense.
Well, all of the above. And if I think it was the Alberta Prime Minister said something about talking about the manufacturing capacity, I think, of EV cars and the allocation. And she said basically, and I'm going to misquote this, but by like January 15th of whatever year, every car allocated to Alberta would have been purchased. So if you needed a new vehicle that year, you're out of luck. It's not going to be available, because the gas and diesel vehicles will no longer be legal to be manufactured. I don't know what the plan would be to take them off the road, but presumably infrastructure would start to be depleted. So the gas stations would not be replaced or renewed or repaired when they hit the end of their life cycle. And that EV stations would be the replacement. So more and more, we're going to get squeezed out, whether it's mandated like by law or whether it's just that the infrastructure is changing. And that's, even the infrastructure changing is not going to be market driven. It's going to be authoritarian governments mandating that. And Canada is, I would say, is one of the worst. I mean, I would say unless there's some major, I'm not going to say that what would it take, but to stop this from going communism, I don't until you define communism, but I think Canada is well on its way.
Yeah, I think we're definitely moving towards a more centralized power structure, and whatever that means in terms of financial system the shape that it takes is anyone's guess, I suppose. I know that you value your gray man style of living. Like you try to keep a pretty low profile and low key approach to this. And for us as public figures, I guess, that's kind of hard to do sometimes, right? So why the emphasis on being so gray man and being so discreet just for people who are just kind of getting involved in this? Because I think that's an important component of what you're doing, and trying to kind of disappear, so to speak, is not as easy as people think.
It's almost impossible. I mean, I just saw something shared, I think, on the Canadian off-grid Facebook page or something, showing I don't follow the news very closely. I don't watch any mainstream media, so I don't see these things. But apparently there was a law passed in Ontario that unorganized townships are to hire or contract out building inspections, which currently don't exist. And that would be to crack down on people like myself. So that was sort of the one of the places that you could do what you wanted to do, and they're cracking down on that. So with satellite imagery, I mean, I can see my place. If I look hard enough, I can see the beginnings of my homestead, which is publicly available, right? So it's very, very difficult. Yeah. I don't know. If there's nowhere to hide, then you have to find ways just to work within the system. But at some level, it's not just governments, it's actually current thinking. Like the average Canadian would agree with the majority of what our government mandates. So how do you educate the people not to be the ones to report you, for example, for doing something on the fringes of what's acceptable? So I don't know. I mean, I can't answer that definitively. There's very few jurisdictions that you can do what you want to do. So I guess it's figure out how to work within the system. Like tiny homes finally getting approved is one example of, sort of a compromise. So you can get a tiny home that's legal and have it on a property and comply with the local regulations, but live at least relatively self-reliantly, but also debt-free as much as possible, because that's really how they get you as well, right? If you need to purchase things, or you need a mortgage, or you need insurance, and you have to comply with all of, higher than the law typically, but you have to, comply with all the rules and regulations. So you got to find your people too, and find, people that you're going to work cooperatively, that are not going to put you in a position like my old neighbors did, where they don't want you there, then they have ways to force you out.
Yeah, and unfortunately, in a lot of those rural communities, if a person doesn't have something to preoccupy their time, that they're spending all their time plotting and scheming on you, right? So I think that's an important point, is neighbors, and finding, you obviously had to, you invested a lot into that first, a lot of time, and you just made that decision to pack up and rebuild somewhere else.
You have to be honest. Why are people typically that far out of the urban areas, or like typically not a very inspiring area, for example? So you're kind of out in the middle of nowhere because it's undesirable to most people. So why would you typically choose that? Is because you don't really fit into society. So I count myself in that category, but doesn't mean everybody's, most savory individuals that have the same way of thinking. So you really need to prove yourself, because there's the cliche, the city, it's coming up from the city, moving into the country, and then imposing all the same ways of being that they had in the city, like property rights, for example, and like, stay off my property, posted where somebody's been hunting or fishing or trapping that property forever, generations, and you come in there and buy it and shut it down. So that you create this bad blood by not, having that rural community mindset. If you go in too individualistic, then you are definitely going to make enemies. So then you have to shore yourself up against those enemies, either through privacy, like not letting people know you're there, or other means that are less desirable and more difficult to impose.
That's really good advice. So don't bring the city with you. Don't bring the city mentality with you, is what you're saying, or try not to. Yeah, because that's one of my biggest concerns, is in finding land, and maybe we can talk a little bit about what made you select the land that you did, without going into specifics, of course. But one of my biggest concerns is, am I going to get along well with the community? And also in terms of like just strategically relocating to a place where everything is going to be there, and it is actually going to be sustainable in terms of providing us with everything that we need. Can you maybe talk a little bit about why you selected the property you did, and what were some of the factors that went into that decision?
Well, I have a family, so geography, like proximity, relative proximity to them, was a concern. The province I live in takes 24 hours to get across it, so I could be definitely more remote if I didn't have a family, and I would have chosen that. So that was the first consideration. So within shooting distance of family, and then the most rural and quiet place I could find within that area. And then, well, and typically that means staying away from the big lakes, because there's 250,000, 25-acre plus lakes in Ontario, and most of them are developed. So you don't have solitude typically, because they are developed and the sound travels. So you don't have that quiet that I was seeking. Then you have to kind of get on these roads, or get into the backcountry where it's maybe doesn't have a road, so it's less accessible. But then typically these are areas that where there is water bodies, they're more, shallower water bodies. They're lakes and rivers instead of big, deep water, lake trout lakes, for example, and usually not very good agricultural zones here in Ontario.
Yeah.
So
there's always a trade-off.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you try to make that work. So I put myself in these undesirable properties, and then try to make them fit into a homestead, and, shore up the homestead capabilities by improving soil and, doing habitat management like I'm doing right now, because they've been neglected for so long that it's not even great for wildlife where I'm at now, unless I enhance the habitat. It's a lot more work to buy a degraded or undesirable property, but that you get those other traits that you're looking for: the privacy, the quiet, the solitude. access to resources because there's less people. Therefore, the game that is there, I have no competition for it.
Yeah, that's I had somebody on the channel, Praxis Prepper, who was talking about that thing where you almost just have to settle for a less desirable spot because what's desirable to the city person is unfortunately not what you want if you're really focused on self-reliance and trying to, heaven forbid, survive a protracted polycrisis collapse scenario. I think in that video, I related it to, if you're going camping and you have to kind of pick a spot, it's like, where do I put the tent down? And once you kind of get into the spot, you kind of work with it and you realize, oh, you kind of make it home and you get acquainted with the spot and you start to learn all the little nuances. But I think that's one of the biggest things, especially for a person like me who I don't want to move twice. So if I make that decision, I want it to be the final decision, which might be, unfortunately, what prevents me from taking action soon enough. But so security is a big thing for you. Is there any other things with considering the security component that come to mind or that stand out for you in terms of advice you could give to people, just having that mindset? Is security even a thing where you're at, or is it more just worried about bears getting into the root cellar?
I've been fortunate, I would say, even in the first place. First of all, there was an unsavory segment of the community there that admired what I was doing because they saw my work ethic. They saw that I was not imposing on others. And as a result, they actually kept an eye out for me and my property to the point where I didn't lock my door and I kept my equipment, tools and things out and didn't have to worry about that. Where I am now, there's one neighbor within, say, 6 kilometers, one neighbor, and then there's a few hunt camps. Same thing. The neighbor knows I'm there, and we get along great. We have each other's numbers. If we need help, we support each other. Other than that, everybody else nobody else really knows about the cabin. They know there's properties in the area, but because there's nobody living there, it's very seasonal. Like it's literally a week or 5 days during the moose season and maybe 8 days of actual deer hunting during the 2-week rifle season. Other than that, there's nobody there. So same thing. I have no issues with privacy or security. However, it's difficult to access. And if people were to access it, I do have cameras set up, cell cameras, and I would know that if they're there, and there's not great access from anywhere except, say, one place that they would enter from.
Yeah. So you're like a few hours from like a major urban center?
Oh, yeah.
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 So you're within range that you could drive it quickly if you needed to, or, somebody could evacuate to there or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
In terms of like wild game, have you managed to, like, are you just baiting, or how are you managing to keep the animals near, and is there fishing nearby, or is it mostly just big game?
Like, again, to go back to the transportation issue, here's another tip I would say is set yourself up as a company and try to run things through that. I would say that my big diesel truck that I use for transporting materials and ATVs and so on is probably less likely to be I think you probably get taxed pretty heavily on vehicles that you're using of that nature for personal use, but as a business, I'm assuming I'll get a little bit more leeway. Mm-hmm. And then there's other things you can do that gives you some tax breaks and so on. So I would suggest setting yourself up that way. If and when transportation becomes an issue, either through high price of fuel or, the EV fiasco, then I want to make sure that I'm within walking distance or small engine distance of lakes and rivers. So I can walk to a couple of different lakes, probably 3 different lakes that I can fish on. And wildlife, well, yesterday, Kelly and I were back in the woods behind the cabin. I was actually cutting in a food plot, but a 3/4 acre food plot. And as we were just scouting around that area, Kelly put up 4 different grouse, a couple of hares. I've got it's not great for deer. Like, it's not a high density area, but I've got about a dozen whitetails per year typically that are hanging around the property. And then I have just tons of moose. I just happen to I'm in a pocket of ideal habitat for them. So I've constantly have moose walking around the cabin. Bears, same thing. Again, walking around yesterday, found a bunch of hair from coyotes or wolves where they had taken down a moose or they had stolen the moose hide out of my compost pile. I'm not sure which, but lots and lots of animals. But again, the habitat improvement, so the forest management is necessary in order to hold those whitetail deer. But in the meantime, yes, I do feed them.
Okay.
I do it year round. Like I put out mineral licks as well as food, more so to monitor rather than to hunt. But then, of course, that becomes an attractant during the hunting season as well.
And do you do any animal husbandry like chickens or rabbits or anything?
Probably will again. I haven't, because we have been sort of between places and had to move on. Like I was just getting ready to add a chicken coop to the old cabin when we decided that the neighbor issue was too much to handle and didn't. I'm getting to the point now. It could be 2024 that I add chickens back in, but in the past we've leased out land where I've raised Dexter cattle with my wife, heritage pigs. I've done up to 100 meat chickens. In the tractors, like dragging them around the pasture. I've had up to 24 maybe hens, laying hens at one time. I've raised Cotternick's quail, bobwhite quail, rabbits, pretty well. So that's pretty much everything. That's the thing about choosing land. Like there's no reasonably priced, especially private agricultural land where I could have pasture, for example, for beef or for lambs or even pasturing pork. So it's not an option really for me. So what's the next best thing I could do is to enhance the wildlife population. So that becomes my big game. I'm surrounded by marshes full of ducks and geese. So there's my fowl. So really the egg thing is the maybe the hole in our life. But yeah. I would like we have a neighbor that not a close neighbor, but I go and buy 10 or 20 dozen eggs at a time and put them in the cellar. And they don't have, if you buy them from people that know not to wash the eggs, you can keep them at room temperature for a really long time. So you don't need to have them in the refrigerator, or you can glass them, or you learn these little tricks that we did in the past, knew in the past, and we've lost that knowledge, but you don't need to have full refrigeration for most of your food.
Wow. It sounds like you're in a place where the carrying capacity of the land could support you and your family and probably even a bigger, small community without having to have your own animal husbandry. And interesting you bring up, the neighbors, and there's a little bit of specialization there within the community that you might be able to develop some kind of barter system at some point.
Well, we do that now, even like so raw milk, I mean, just mentioning it, you can get you in trouble, but we do have a farmer that we drive to get raw milk, and we buy, what are we getting now? 60 liters at a time. So frozen, 40 liters frozen, and then 20 that my wife makes cheese from. And then rather than me put on, 10 pounds a week eating all that cheese, we'll use that to barter for other items in some cases. So, and even that milk will offset the cost of getting that milk by providing her with wild game and vegetables that we grow.
That's excellent. And in terms of the garden that you're putting in, obviously you're in the Canada latitudes. I think in some places in Ontario you can grow a little bit more than we grow here. It's a bit more mild. But here, we're I think in zone 3 or something. Like we just grow grains basically. We can grow potatoes, very short growing season. How is your agriculture or your horticulture setup going in terms of your garden?
Well, I would say I didn't calculate it this year, and I didn't care quite as much because I had a really successful big game season or year. But I think we could easily grow enough calories for at least 3 or 4 of us from the garden at the point that it's at now. I grew 500 pounds of potatoes this year. I could have easily grown more. We had the space for it. We grew sweet potatoes, which you think of as just as a warm climate crop. But we're able to grow them here. I'm in zone 4, just to put that in perspective. So our growing season basically Victoria Day weekend, so the third week in May till roughly October 1st. It gets quite hot. It gets quite dry for a good part of that. So irrigation is fairly important,
Mm,
but these soils are horrible. We have very acidic soils and very sandy where I am.
yeah.
So I have to add a lot of organic material to get it to that point. But it's only going to improve. And the fruit trees that I've been planting over the last 4 years they started producing very light crops last year. I expect to get some pretty decent crops from them this year.
So you're saying you really have to cultivate this for an extended period of time for it to really reach its maturity in terms of output.
Yeah, and then it can just keeps getting better and better. Like I don't know how many pounds of blueberries I got this year, but pretty like massive amounts, like 5 gallon pails full for fresh eating and freezing and dehydrating and freeze drying. Uh, Raspberries, strawberries. So a lot of perennials, just to make that point. So as many perennial systems as you can get in place, the better. So the fruit trees, the nuts, I planted probably 150 hazelnut bushes over the last few years. I would say next 2024 will probably be the first year that we'll get some production. But I'm planting another 25 or 50 maybe. Well, I bought enough tree tubes to put in 100 more trees this year. I've got 25 chestnuts, hybrid chestnuts that should do well in this area. I've got those in pots right now to plant out in the spring. Uh, all kinds, yeah, just tons of perennial stuff, and then the annuals are easy, relatively easy.
Wow. Yeah, that seems like you're, you're gonna build a kingdom there that everybody's gonna be. A lot of people are gonna be looking to you for leadership if and when things go south. In terms of, I guess, some of the other threats, like, do you ever worry about like forest fires and things of that nature? Do you have a plan for that? Because this year in Canada was, I think it was 3 times more area burned than the previous record. So are you at all concerned, or do you have like a buffer zone, or do you have a contingency plan for that?
So I have two properties that I keep separate. Basically, it's that philosophy: two is one, one is none.
Hmm.
And I've basically built two homesteads with that in mind. So I have enough shelter, food, water, and so on for the extended family. So not just for my wife and I. So for daughters and their boyfriends or husbands, future husbands, as well as probably parents and sisters. And one of the properties is completely deciduous and historically is not a fire zone. So I'm not concerned at all here. Like the cabin property is, say 75% conifer, and that is at risk. And if it wasn't for the fact, see, I'm not way up in the boreal forest in the middle of nowhere where these forest fires go on and they're left unchecked or
Yeah.
relatively unchecked because it's a natural process.
Okay.
Because I'm somewhat close to urban centers, fires are suppressed. So there hasn't been a fire here well, according to the charred stumps that I find and the growth rings in the trees that are on my property, has been between 85 and 100 years ago was the last fire here. So low incidence. I am at risk. I mean, I could be the one to start the forest fire. If there was to be one there, it'd probably be my cause.
Yeah.
So I'm prepared to, what would I lose? The cabin, I think I can protect that pretty easily. I have a stream right below it. I have water pumps, gas-fired
Okay.
pumps, as well as solar water pumps,
Hmm.
fire extinguishers for small fires. I have chainsaws sitting right there. I can cut trees down. They're, easily fell them in the other direction. So I'm pretty confident I could withstand that. The metal roof was a consideration this time on this cabin. So there is a metal roof on it.
Yeah.
Less, risk. So
So you have an irrigation set up that's powered, then it's not all like manual or.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Gas. I've got two gas water pumps, and that's what I irrigate the crops with.
Hmm.
And then I have solar pumps in the stream itself that can pump up to the cabin as well.
So if you ran out of gas, you could use the solar
I do have a hand pump as well. I mean, it depends on the
Right.
amount of water, or I could just take 5 gallon pails. But I mean, realistically, you would need the high pressure water pump in order to suppress a fire in conifers, and
Hmm.
especially a log cabin in conifers.
Yeah.
But I'm not concerned about it. Like I said, there's only a few trees that are even within falling distance of it, and I am thinning the forest out as
As
more
you go.
time I spend managing the property, the more I thin out all the ground fuel around the cabin.
Yeah, that's one of the concerns that I've had is, getting a property because you kind of want that the shelter and the experience of being in the forest, but then you have to balance out these other possible threats. And as you say, I think, what I'm getting from what you're saying is, the sooner you start to develop and kind of cultivate the land, the better it's going to be and the more exponential the yield curve will be when, if and when things go south. Was there something that compelled you to make your YouTube channel? Was it one day you said, I'm gonna, throw this on the internet and see what happens, or how did that story come about?
Well, the brand itself came out of that 2010 failure of my business, and we we sat down, my wife and we just basically reprioritized our life. And food, well, family was first. Food was, right near the top. My healthy food. We eat very cleanly, very organically, very little processed foods. So even while we were still living in that suburban small village, it was a village of 900, but we rented the land. It was a free lease, basically. 118-acre plot of land with 18 acres of field. So that's where we did all the food stuff, like the animal husbandry. But we just prioritized that, and then kind of just led from there. Like,
So it started off as like a concerted effort to make a YouTube channel then, or
no, I'd say the brand came out of that. Like the
yeah,
brand My Self Reliance was really just a website, and my intent was to teach, basically document what we were doing. But in that time, it was more about blogs. So it
yeah,
was me documenting the raising of the cattle, and I was filming with just, I don't even know what, like a little basic camera, not for YouTube at all. Actually, it was just for the website. And I just, yeah, it was kind of accidental YouTube. I was participating in some canoeing and fishing forums, and people were uploading their short videos of their canoe trips and writing blog posts basically to go with it, like trip reports, I guess you would call it. And I actually wrote a trip report and filmed a short video to go along with that trip report, put it up on my website, and then put it into a contest, a writing contest up in Muskoka, and won $100 gift certificate for Algonquin Outfitters for my article. And then it kind of just snowballed from there. So I started writing articles for Ontario tourism. And while I was doing that, I would film something to be a link within the article itself. And then I ran into a couple of guys that were doing YouTube full time. And I didn't even know what that meant. We went out on a couple of trips, and finally, one of them asked me why I don't have monetization turned on my channel. I still didn't know after like a year and a half that you could monetize YouTube. So once I figured that out and turned it on, it was just a little bit of money here and there dribbling in from it. But as soon as I started the first cabin, it just took off, and that it became full time within a year.
yeah. I think I remember possibly seeing you on the trending page, and it was like that must have been quite the moment for you to that was quite the inflection point with your YouTube career. Like it was you really, I don't think there was a lot of people doing what you were doing at the time. Now there's more people kind of getting into it, but how was that experience being, like just, having that viral moment? That must have been something else.
I don't have much of an ego. Like I don't stroke my ego, so I never really. I guess I take for granted successes. Like I've had success in sports and in business before the failure, and I don't ever really do it for that reason. I kind of just put my all into everything that I do, and then I tend to do fairly well typically.
Yeah.
But that always also puts me in a risky position. Like I'm the monopoly player that just buys everything and runs out of cash. And if, I land on somebody else's thing, I'm out early,
Oh shit.
or I win the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So that's the way I kind of live my life. So I'm all in. And with YouTube, when it took off like that, I was working really hard at it at that point. Like I'm working not in a job, but working, say, 7 days a week on building this homestead, and including that cabin at the beginning, and then editing. And I could barely turn a computer on at the beginning of this. Like, I did not know how to edit or film. So I'm learning as I'm going. So that's how much effort I had to put in to overcome my lack of knowledge and experience and skill.
Yeah.
So when it took off, it wasn't, all I thought is, I better capitalize on this. I better work harder. It was never, I can't believe this is happening to me. I'm so fortunate. It was like, okay, I got to buckle down even more. Like, it took off, but that, to me, that could end tomorrow. I could be the 15 minutes of fame. And that's not the way I wanted for it to be for me.
Well, I think that's the most success stories are like that, like enduring ones that aren't flashes in the pan. There are people who really love what they do, and they never got into it for the purpose of getting famous or anything like that. They believe in what they're doing, and as a consequence of your motivation and your commitment, you're rewarded how you were. And it's nice to see a person who's humble in that respect and being rewarded, because it's not always the case. Sometimes you get people who get there and do have an ego, and oftentimes in our society that is something that people are encouraging and endorsing and wanting more of. So you're kind of taking the alternate route. But so how do you find peace with nature? Because I think oftentimes it takes me, I'd say, about 3 days to get broken in. If I go out like on a walkabout, it takes a long time to it's like I'm like the Tin Man when I first go out there. I got that city walk, and I'm all, like everything's bothering me. Do you have any advice for people? How do you get into the mindset where you're not at war with the elements, and you're actually, like, I'm not sure if you know what I mean, but there's with some people, they have this thing where they can go into nature and they can just be at peace with the bugs, the weather, the conditions. Is there mental strategies that you can share with people about that?
I think part of it's got to be innate, like I mentioned earlier. I remember I must have been 20 or 21, and the Tragically Hip were putting on an outdoor concert just north of Toronto, and me and all my buddies went down there, and it was an evening thing. And I remember being in the massive crowd. Everybody's dancing and drinking and carrying on. And all I could think of during that moment was, I can't wait to leave here and go up to my property. I literally left and drove. It would have been about 3.5 hours from there, so that I could sit under the stars beside a campfire in a tent. I didn't even have the cabin built at that point, and just unwind. So it's just that, to me, that's where I've always felt most comfortable. So that, I don't know if you can train that or learn that. But I do believe that that's where we're meant to be. And I think the modern world I think if modernity wasn't so easy, if it made us more as comfortable as it does, I don't think we'd be as drawn to it. And that being in nature would be the place that we feel more comfortable. But we've become fearful. And I know in the past, and a lot of we are of a culture that's been sort of against nature, conquering nature, where a lot of cultures live with nature, more nature based, more natural beings. I think they're the cultures that have been more satisfied or placid, integrated, less seeking. I think our modern culture, we're always seeking something, and maybe it's seeking that simplicity and seeking nature. That's actually the thing missing from our lives, but it doesn't seem that way, right? We seem to be drawn to this. I don't know. I talk often about conservation of energy and how it's a good survival strategy to be lazy and take the path of least resistance. But I find that the least meaningful one. And if you go back to nature and integrate into nature rather than trying to conquer it, I think it's just, I don't know, it's just more natural and more satisfying. So now, if you're modern, so I know to answer your question, if you're a modern man and you want to learn how to become more natural or to live a simpler life, you have to educate yourself, and you have to eliminate the fear by learning what the threats actually are. Like the fear of bears, for example. People, of course, especially when they see me cooking and processing game, like in the cabin or on the edge of the cabin or in the outdoor kitchen, like, why aren't you afraid of bears? Or why are, what an idiot, bears and wolves are going to come in and attack you or, threaten your dog or whatever. But that's just not the way nature works. So when you learn that, that's not a fear that you have anymore. If you learn, in my area, it's black bears, not grizzly bears. If you research, and I do this, and I have books on bear attacks, I know how rare it is. Even though some of those situations could be risky, it's so rare that I feel way safer sleeping under the stars with no tent, no sleeping bag in bear territory. I feel way safer there than I do walking downtown Toronto.
That's what I was just going to say. Downtown Toronto comes to mind. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, a friend of mine, Nate Hagen's natural resource expert, we had him on the channel recently. He said that people trade, barrels of oil for microliters of dopamine. And I think there's this hamster wheel we get on in the city where you keep needing a greater and greater experience to get the same amount of dopamine. It's like diminishing returns. But when you're going back around the campfire, you find that balance with things where you're not constantly seeking, you're in the moment, you have everything you need in the moment. And, when I take my kids out camping, it's like, we have our, everything scaled down. We have our little meal. And, I recall them distinctly saying, we have everything we need. And they were so happy because they just had everything that we needed, we had. It wasn't any more than that. It wasn't in excess. There wasn't, 50,000 things distracting them. For a lot of people, it's going to be a shock initially. There's almost going to be like kind of like a withdrawal period from that, I think. And I guess nature has its own share of challenges, and maybe people need to be prepared for adapting and adjusting to that. That you're not going to be able to control everything. You're going to have to go at the pace of things and relinquish control to the environment in large part.
But that's more exciting. I mean, you mentioned challenges. People are meant to be challenged. We need adventure to be satisfied, and things have gotten so comfortable that we seek these little micro challenges, like the popularity of the cold plunge right now, or extreme running and all that all these things we're going to the gym, for that matter. I laughed. My daughter and her boyfriend went to the gym last week on Christmas. I think it was Christmas Day, feeling guilty about what they ate. I went out and cut enough firewood for half a year, burned way more calories than them, and accomplished something. So I challenged myself. I did something physical that keeps me healthy. So it's so multifaceted, this lifestyle, when you choose to not do these micro challenges because your life is too comfortable, but to choose an uncomfortable life so that the challenges are the reward. Learning how to manage resources, but also just right down to what tools are needed. So what's the priority? What do you buy first when you have a little bit of extra income? What do you invest your money into?
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.